Matthew chapter 16 is where we're picking up tonight and discussing where we began this morning with spiritual perception. And that when we interact with Jesus, there's always an action or a reaction that we have, a response that we have. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're not so good. One of the things that causes us to kind of pause and really think is the fact that a lot of people who had interactions with him had less than favorable interactions with him. They failed to perceive what it was that they were doing or who Jesus was or what he was about. And so this morning we looked in Matthew 16, the first 4 verses, about perceiving the times. They could read the skies, they could predict weather, but they couldn't see their Savior standing right in front of them. And then in verses 5 through 12, they have this difficulty understanding what Jesus is saying about bread, but he's not really saying anything about bread. He's saying something about the teaching of the scribes and the Pharisees and the ability to be able to take the teaching of God and make the applications to ourselves. So number 3, I guess overall, but number 1 tonight, is in verses 13 through 20, we need to perceive the identity of Jesus. We need to perceive the identity of Jesus. These words are familiar, but of course they bear repeating. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah," or son of John is a more literal translation. "For flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. So this is obviously a benchmark moment in the history of Jesus and his disciples as they make a confession. Now let's think about it a little bit more deeply. It says first they came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, which is really Gentile region. It had recently been rebuilt or renamed, obviously by Philip the Tetrarch, who was you can see Caesarea, Caesar, you can see it there in the word, and then Philippi, you can see Philip. And so Philip was a tetrarch. He was a son of Herod the Great and had recently renamed this particular location. Before, it had been a place where there was, it was the primary city of the worship of the sun god Pan, P-A-N, okay? And so if you see that kind of geographical setting and context, when Jesus says, "Who do people say that I am?" in the background you would see the temples of the region of Caesarea Philippi. It's about 25 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. Most people think the Sea of Galilee is the northernmost point. There's plenty more miles, at least 25, and then you get to Lake Hula, which is actually at the very top, and then it descends to the Jordan that goes to the Galilee, that goes down the Jordan that goes to the Dead Sea. And so they're in this region, which is interesting that he goes to a Gentile region. And there is where the confession is made about him, and there is where his promise is made about building the church, is in Gentile country. It tells you something about his mission being universal and not just Jewish in its scope. And so he said, in essence, who do people say that I am? You look at the backdrop, you look at the city, I know people aren't going to get that answer right. Okay? But then they gave some answers that other people would have given. Some say you're John the Baptist. That was a common association. Herod had that same idea. He thought that he was John the Baptist risen from the dead. Some say you're Elijah. The fiery preaching, the performing of miracles, the way that Elijah did so much of in his ministry that we've been studying, or we finished studying several Wednesday nights ago. Or Jeremiah, who was a young, passionate preacher who was always in trouble with the leaders of his day. The religious leaders did not like him because of the way he handled things, and the truths that he taught and the challenges that he put forth, or one of the prophets. Now, here's the thing. Putting Jesus in that company, in people's minds, they think that they're paying him a compliment. And you know, if any of us were ever mentioned in this company, we would consider it to be prestigious company. And that would have been an acceptable statement about so many different people, but it was not about Jesus. And then he turns the question, he says, but who do you say that I am? You're my disciples. You've been with me. At this point, he's about halfway through his ministry, maybe 2 years in, at least a year and a half, maybe 2. And he turns to them, and it's as if he's saying, I expect them to kind of miss it. But what about you? Who do you say that I am? And of course, Peter, most likely speaking for all of them, says, well, you're the Christ. The anointed one, not his last name, this beautiful Old Testament imagery of Messiah. Okay, Messiah is Old Testament, Christ is New Testament. Or Messiah, I should say Messiah is Hebrew, and Christ is Greek. But you're the anointed one. You're the one that God has chosen, the one we've been waiting for. The Son of the living God. Son, equal with God. John 5 and verse 18. You remember they tried to kill Jesus because he called God his Father, making himself equal with God. So you're the Son of the living God. And then Jesus pronounces a blessing like the Beatitude, a Makarios, on him, saying, this is a blessed state. For an individual, you remember there are 2 words used for blessed in the New Testament. And the one that is used in the Beatitudes is the same one used here. And what it means is, it's not in the sense of pronouncing a blessing. That's eulogeo. We get the English word eulogy from it, okay? To speak well of another. It's not pronouncing a blessing upon someone. It's setting up someone and saying, this is what the blessed life looks like, especially in the Hebrew concept of shalom and those things. This is what the blessed life looks like. And so he says, Peter, you're an example of the blessed life that can receive and understand or perceive the identity of Jesus. Jesus is saying, you perceive me. That's part of the blessed life that God has intended for us, to realize who Jesus is in his identity. Now, and then of course he makes the promises to build his church. We will come back to this text at a later date and dive into all of its intricacies, but right now we're simply studying the text under spiritual perception, okay? Now, when we think about the identity of Jesus, we have to really stop and think, do we perceive or understand who Jesus is? Because one of the things that I'm concerned about for myself as well as other people is that our familiarity with Jesus has lessened him in our eyes. Now, I would not trade my familiarity with Jesus for anything in the world. But it is something we have to keep a watch on, that it does not lessen him in our eyes, that we have to remind ourselves who we're dealing with. That Jesus is God. He's more than just a great counselor. He's more than just a moral teacher. He's the Son of God. He is God. And when you deal with God, he deserves, the natural response is the utmost measure of devotion. Everything we do becomes wrapped up in him. And so the question is, do we perceive who Jesus is? You know, we talk about him so much. Do we really grasp it? I find it interesting that in the Old Testament, there was a specific name of God that the Jews refused to pronounce, and actually even to this day refuse to pronounce it. Dr. Gallagher, who was here back in May, studied at the Hebrew Union, which is it's a place where Jewish men go to study to be rabbis. It's purely Hebrew. That's why they call it Hebrew Union. There are 2 campuses. One is in Cincinnati and the other one is in Jerusalem. He studied there. And even in class and in ways that they dealt with things, they were not allowed to pronounce this particular name of God because it's not something you do. For an example, he would say when he was researching in the library and he had to run copies, and the copy didn't turn out very well, if that copy contained the name of God, it had to be placed in a separate bin to be disposed of in a certain way because of their honor for the name of God. And I sometimes wonder if maybe we treated the name of Jesus that way, maybe we treated the name of God that way a little bit more, it might strike something into us and really impress upon us that who we're dealing with is someone that's far different than anyone we've ever known. His identity becomes the very foundation of the church. And so everything that I am should be wrapped up in who he is. This is Mark 12 and verse 30. This is the greatest command. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, and with all of your strength. Listen, if Jesus is who he says he is, and he is, I'm convinced of it. If he is who he says he is, the only response is radical devotion. It's the only response that makes any type of sense. To look at it and go, makes zero sense. As we've said many times before, maybe even last week, to say he's a good teacher doesn't make any sense. Because he makes the claim that he is God. And if he's not God, that makes him a liar. That makes him a false teacher. So he's not a good moral teacher. You see, he doesn't position himself in that light. And so he either is exactly who he says he is, or he isn't. And if he is who he says he is, that's not just a game changer, that's not just a life changer, that's an eternity changer. And our response has to be just as radical as that truth of his identity. And so when you look at this Shema that was quoted by Jesus in Mark 12 and verse 30, love God with all of your heart. Now, heart many times in the Bible will have reference to your mind, but not always. And this is an occasion where it doesn't have reference to the mind, because the mind is specifically singled out in this discussion in Mark 12. So heart here is actually a reference to the emotion. Okay? Having an emotional tie to Jesus, being emotionally invested in and wrapped up in Jesus. Or something like the psalmist said in Psalm 119, verse 136, rivers of waters or streams of waters flow from my eyes because they do not keep your law. I'm invested in who you are, and it bothers me when I don't keep your law, and it bothers me when other people disregard you. When you mock Jesus, that bothers me. That's my Jesus. I'm invested in him. He's invested in me. He's all the world to me. To come after him is not something I'm going to take very nicely. Because I love him. Because you love him. I'm emotionally invested in him. And then you have the soul. And there have been discussions through the years about exactly what he has reference to here. And I've not really seen anything that changed my mind concerning this. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means I haven't seen it yet. But I've always kind of understood the soul to be the volitional side of man. And the volitional side of man is your decision making. To love God with your volition. To love God with your decisions. If Jesus is who he says he is, and he is, shouldn't he then dictate and be the center or the grid by which I make every other decision? I mean, this is not a choice here. Okay? So, I've got my ball game. One of my boys has got a ball game on a Sunday, right in the middle of worship services. Listen, as hard as he has practiced and as much as he has put into it, that's not a decision for me. It's not a decision for a child of God. That baseball will do nothing for him at the end of his life. That baseball will not love him. But the Jesus to which I bring him will always love him. That decision was made a long time ago. That's not really a hard decision in the sense that which one am I going to choose? It may be difficult, and there's nothing wrong with it being difficult to watch them work hard and then to not be able to use those talents they developed at that particular time. Especially Sundays are usually championship game Sundays. But he dictates that decision. Because Jesus is more than a ball that is white with red seams. Number 3, to love him with the mind, which is the intellectual. Expending my mind to understand who God is. You see, a lot of people, they come and they expect to read the Bible and to understand it the way they read a book. It just doesn't work that way. It's not intended to work that way. A book that you could read one time, sit it on the shelf and say, I got it, wouldn't change the world. And it couldn't contain God because God is greater than that. Some people, they look at Bible study and say, I don't want to do it because it's hard. Yes, it can be. And it's supposed to be. You're dealing with God. God is not simple, as much as some people want to make him out to be. He's not simple. And so I have to be willing to expend the mental energy. And someone says, well, I'm just not getting it. Listen, I get it. As hard as it may be for some people to believe, I'm actually quite a dense person. And I can remember sitting in Isaiah class in the afternoon looking at Brother Mosier going, what in the world is this man talking about? Why is the sky being rolled up like a scroll? Why are there fig leaves falling? What is this? It doesn't make any sense. And then when I got out of school and I'd continue to read those prophets and keep coming back to them, even though I didn't understand it. You keep coming back to it because eventually with repetition you start to pick up on what they're saying. You start to pick up on how they're saying it. But more than that, God wanted me to have that book. And I love him enough, you love him enough, to expend the energy to know why. To expend the energy to know the God of that book. I love him with my mind. I'll do anything I can to understand him better. And then to love him with all of our strength. That's physical. That's obvious. Using our bodies in the service of God. We use our bodies in the service of God. Not just in worship services, but in other things that we do. That, you know what, I think a common one that we can all experience, especially if you have kids, is you wake up Sundays and you feel tired. I was never so happy to see my house as I was last night. I don't know what time it was, 8:30, 9, but I was never so happy to see it. I hadn't slept in a week. I'm tired right now. But you get up and you go. Because that's what love is. Love is commitment. I don't care how I feel. I love you. God, I love you. And you're worth getting out of bed in the morning when I don't feel like it. You're worth pushing myself beyond boundaries that I didn't even know I had. I'll use my body any way that it takes to serve you. That's a whole Romans 6 discussion where God focuses in on what it really looks like to love God with our bodies, to use our bodies as servants of Christ and as slaves of Christ. But when you understand, and when I understand his identity, those things become natural. All right, number 2 tonight, 4 overall. Verses 21 through following, he wants us to have spiritual perception about sacrifice. So here he is, and we've been through this great confession, and then in verse 21, it says this: From that time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders, and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised again. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Pretty bold move, right? Saying, Far be it from you, Lord. This will never happen to you. Now, in English, it looks as if he's just saying this will never happen to you, but in the original text, it's actually a double negative. It's an emphatic statement of saying, this isn't going to happen to you. I've just said you're the Messiah, but you said you were going to die, and I'm telling you that won't happen to you. Then watch Jesus' response. But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan, for you are a hindrance or a stumbling block to me. For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. Your understanding of Messiah is still incomplete. That being Messiah, it means to suffer. It means to suffer. Now, the Jews had this idea, and if we're fair, especially if you read the Old Testament, you can honestly see where they would have read certain texts and thought that the Messiah was going to be a political figure, a warrior. Okay? And you know, truth be told, he was a warrior. He is a warrior. He is a king, just not in the sense that they thought. His warfare was spiritual in its nature. It wasn't a wrestle against the Roman government. It was a wrestle with the evil behind the Roman government. We do not wrestle against flesh and blood, Ephesians 6 and verse 12, but against principalities and powers and rulers in the heavenly places. He disarmed them, Colossians chapter 2 and verse 15, through the cross. And so suffering was part of who he was, part of his identity. Now watch what he says in response. After he calls Peter Satan, not that he is Satan, but that he's acting like Satan, because Satan tried to get him in his temptation in Matthew 4 to circumvent this whole suffering process. And that's what Peter's trying to do here. You're not going to suffer. And he says, no, you're acting like Satan did. And then in verse 24, Jesus told his disciples, If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Luke's account says it's daily. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? So I want to come at this in 2 tiers. First, about the suffering of Jesus. Do we understand the suffering of our Savior to the degree that we can as human beings? I mean, we're never going to fully comprehend it, I don't think. But do we understand that he suffered? Do we understand what his body went through at the cross? Scourging, bearing, nailing, raising, sitting, breathing. I mean, it was horrendous. And we talked about that, I don't know, a while ago on a Sunday morning, maybe last year, maybe the year before that. But do we perceive what he really endured physically? This is in no way to downplay physically what he endured, But of all the things he endured, the physical side of it was not the hardest. It wasn't the hardest. What he mentally endured, as you see him in the garden in Luke 22, or what he spiritually endured when he says from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? The hardest question in Scripture that I still have no idea what the answer to it is. As one of my favorite preachers says, I don't really know exactly what he means, but I do know this, my God, why? And he says, this is what I know. Whatever it is, I'm the reason. Whatever it is, I am the reason. Do I really understand what Jesus endured? Why he endured it? Why he is a willing sacrifice and his blood had to be shed and the atonement for sins and all of that process, things that we have discussed in great detail on previous occasions. Listen, we're Americans. We're American Christians. We've never really known the depths of persecution. It's still persecution. You know, some people say, well, you've never really been persecuted. You're an American. I don't necessarily think that's accurate. Jesus said persecution is more than just suffering martyrdom. He said, blessed are you when men shall curse you and revile you and cast you out, exclude you, and cast out your name as evil. That's still persecution. But what we have experienced over the last couple of hundred years in a nation, and what we experience right this second, is not the experience of our brothers and sisters throughout the world. There are a multitude of books that are written describing our brothers and sisters and their martyrdom. When Afghanistan fell, they were on the phone with an American Christian, as every one of them were killed. You see, being a Christian in that culture didn't get you any benefit. For many years in the American culture, for a majority of the years of American culture, being a Christian had social benefits. I think that's changing. But it has caused us to look at persecution and martyrdom differently. So when we read about Jesus on the cross, it's just an idea. Like, we've never actually seen anything like that. And you know what? I don't want to see someone die. I don't want to see a brother or sister die that way. But you know, their reality was, when they came to church from Sunday to Sunday, when they got together to worship, it was very possible that somebody who was there the week before, that seat was very conspicuously absent, because that person had been martyred the week before for their faith. When we followed Jesus, who was crucified, put to death as a criminal, we have to realize that when we sign up to follow Jesus, that is a possibility for us. And even if it never comes physically, it will come every single day in another form. And that's what Jesus says here. Then Jesus told his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Whoever would save his life will lose it. Some people think this is talking about martyrdom. I don't necessarily think that's the idea here. I think the one who basically saves his life is the one who wants to live his own way and then just does whatever. Well, he will lose his life. he'll lose his soul. But the person who chooses to give up his life and give up the direction of his life and to give it to God and let him dictate it, that's the person that will save his life. But it's like Jesus is saying, so Peter's rebuking him, you're not going to die. And Jesus, in essence, says, Peter, not only am I going to die, but so are you. If you want to follow me, you're going to learn how to die. You're going to learn how to die every day of your life. As one of my favorite professors often says, that Christianity is really about learning how to die for Jesus. It's really what it's about. Figuring out how to die for the one who died for us. Let him deny himself. Why is it that if our Christianity is such that when God makes a demand of us that we withhold from something we want to do, we think, well, no, that's Jesus. God wouldn't want that. Absolutely he would. Absolutely he would. We have to deny ourselves and take up our cross. Again, what is a cross? It's an instrument of slow and painful and agonizing execution. Take up your cross daily and follow me. This Paul would say later in 1 Corinthians 15, around 31, it may not be it, but it's somewhere there. He would say, I die daily. That every day when you and I get out of bed, we have a choice we have to make. We're either going to do whatever it is that we want to do and live the way that we want to live, or we're going to make the choice to die to ourselves and say, it doesn't really matter what I want to do. This day and every day belongs to God, and whatever he wants me to do, that's what I'm doing that day. I'm going to put myself to death and submit myself to that process. Now, you won't hear that at conferences, and you won't hear that on TV, because that message doesn't draw crowds. But before God, that is the message of God. And may anyone who ever does not give the fullness of that message be cursed by God for misrepresenting the Son of God to the world. He died. How can we expect anything less? But do we get that? You see, that's perception. Do we get it? So in this chapter alone, and we could go all throughout probably pretty much every gospel account looking at stuff like this, where he's pushing us and prodding us and talking to us about perceiving who he is, what he expects, what he wants us to do. But I want to close with perceiving something about the grace of God. Matthew chapter 20. You remember in Matthew 20, we're not going to read the entire parable, but the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who went out to hire people to work in his vineyard. And day laborers would congregate in the city square, and the landowners would come and hire them on a daily basis, and when they were done, they would give them their wage at the end of the day. And so in this particular parable, you've got people who are hired at the beginning of the day at 6 a.m., people who are hired on the 3rd hour, the 6th hour, the 9th hour, and the 11th hour. That is the last hour before quitting time. They worked 1 hour. Now, it comes time for the owner of the field to pay them for their services. Verse 8, and when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last up to the first. Now when those hired at the 11th hour came, each of them received a denarius. Now every one of them had made a deal with the landowner that they would receive a denarius for their work. So here's the 11th hour people, and they get their denarius. Now when those who were hired first came, they thought they would receive more. Well, look, if the 11th hour guy got a denarius and we agreed for a denarius, surely he's going to give us more. But each of them also received a denarius. And on receiving it, they grumbled at the master of the house, saying, these last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat. And he replied to one of them and said, friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius a day? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to the last worker as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge my generosity? What we need to perceive about the grace of God is that it is straight across the board to everyone. Regardless of time served, regardless of actions done, God's grace is open to all people. And we need to perceive that. And this evening, that grace is open to you, it's open to me. But will we perceive the magnitude of that offer? That he's paying us, rewarding us with something we do not deserve because of his Son. If I'll come to him and you'll come to him with a penitent faith, confessing Christ to be immersed in water for the forgiveness of our sins, that grace will be accessed. Or maybe as a Christian needing to be restored, his grace is abundant still. That's the offer that he makes us. Whether we perceive it or not, it's up to us. If we can help you tonight, let us know as we stand and sing this song.